Everybody, this is Virgil Carroll from HiMonkey. We're going to go ahead and get started here now that we're at the 10 o'clock hour, and we just got an hour to kind of go through things. So let's take care of some logistics up front. I'm actually going to skip my first two slides, and then I'll kind of go into my presentation. So, oops, I got to make sure that I do that. A few updates from the user group. Just for anybody that's interested, a reminder that there's two upcoming Kentico Connection conferences. The first one is in Orlando on November 8th through 10th. It's actually going to be at a facility at the SeaWorld in Orlando. Kentico Connection is really a great opportunity for you to get a chance to not only mingle with fellow Kentico professionals, but also get to see a lot of content that's going to be based around kind of a lot of the topics that you're probably interested in, but also some of the new features coming into the new version of Kentico and how to use some of the existing things and some best practices around that. So if you have time, and I know they still have room, I highly recommend that you think about attending that.
Hey, come on in.
Actually based, and there'll be one there, and I'll actually be there as well speaking. Second thing for everybody, we got an exciting new release coming up of Kentico, Kentico 9. That release will be coming up in November 2015. The actual date isn't not confirmed, so it may even be pushed into December, but I'm feeling pretty good that it's going to be in November 2015. There's going to be a lot of new things in it. Overall, the interface didn't really change that much, but some things that you probably want to know is that one, there's a lot of focus on the cloud-based delivery, so Azure delivery, a lot of things. But Kentico 9 really is around kind of cleaning up the code and really increasing the stability and performance of it. And then there's some really cool things around how they're upgrading the marketing campaign manager and some of the things around there. And actually, our next CUG event will be on December 18th. And there'll be more information coming out about that, but that's going to be Brian Solstice from Kentico, their evangelist, taking a look at Kentico 9 for the first time. So hopefully you'll be able to join us as well. Plus also I wanted to let you know that in the next coming weeks, Kentico is also releasing a new content development tool. So I know a lot about this tool because we've actually been helping from the side of really trying to promote good user experience in the tool, so we've been doing a lot of looking at it. But this is going to be coming by the end of October. It's going to be a monthly based subscription model for this content development tool, and it's going to be a cloud-based hosted system. It really is for digital agencies and their content teams they're working with. It's really about allowing teams to be able to produce content inside a content production system and then actually sync it into systems like Kentico. Initially, its main function is going to be to work with the Kentico content management system, but there are plans to have it work with other CMS systems as well. And really, it helps everyone on the team produce content that is structured and aligned with your requirements. And one of the things I'm really excited about is a lot of the projects that we do, where we really, since we do really larger kind of website projects, is that we have content that needs to really get created before the website's even done. And so this is a great opportunity for them to kind of manage the content process and manage the content lifecycle outside of the CMS so that the CMS can get built and then actually push it in once it's there. So a very exciting new tool. They should be making an announcement about that here in the coming weeks. So just a little bit about me, kind of getting the presentation itself started. My name is Virgil Carroll. I am the owner and principal human solutions architect for HiMonkey. I hail from the great state of Alaska. Hopefully most of you have all heard of it. My background actually has nothing to do with technology. I'm a certified athletic trainer by trade, and I also have a master's degree in instructional design. And so my computer education really came more hands-on through the 17 years that I've been in business. I'm a huge user experience aficionado. Again, this topic is going to deal a lot with that. We've been building websites since 1998 and been working with Kentico since 2005. So do have a blog out there and a Twitter account. So let's kind of get in, and today what we're really going to talk about as the title says, is really understanding good information architecture in UX and kind of looking at how we can apply that in a Kentico scenario and that. So this is such a huge topic and still something that's so very important, because a lot of times, even if we have great CMS systems, we have to have the ability to make that content make sense, make the structure make sense, and get people actually to things. So I'm going to start out with the slide that I've used for a number of years in both these type of presentations and my SharePoint presentations and really everything I've done. And I always say that you really have to baseline how people really think about the way they find information on the web and that. And so what I call this is the too easy information seeking model. A person asks a question, some kind of magic happens, and they receive some kind of an answer. And the reason this is significant is because we sometimes forget that we have to baseline the typical person that visits our website at a very, very low level. They have no idea of how technology works, what type of effort you put into the structure of the site or whatever like that. They just know they're trying to find an answer to something when they're visiting your site, and if it's not readily available or something that's very easy to find, a lot of times they won't be successful. So why doesn't do this? Well, a lot of times people don't really know what they're looking for, and that's a very key point, because I may be like, well, I'm on your site because I understand maybe what I'm trying to find, but I don't really know how to find it in that, and so those are really big. This is where large information structures, websites with lots and lots of content or lots of diverse content can become very large problems. Otherwise, this can really cause a lot of issues for people when you're trying to navigate through really large systems and try and figure out what you're going to look at. And so one of the other things that we see a lot, especially today, because there's definitely a trend towards really sparse content, is sometimes this can be a very big benefit in that people are able to scan the content and easily see things. But on the other side, it can also be an issue because you don't have a very descriptive set, and especially when you start dealing with search, something that we're going to talk a lot about in this segment today as well. When you start getting to the search side of things, you start seeing a lot of issues from that because sparse content doesn't allow for very good search in that. And so the other thing that's happening is a lot of today's design patterns always aren't really conducive to that solid findability. And again, this is going to talk a little bit about search. We're going to kind of talk about it, but this whole long page structure gives us some great opportunities from a navigational side, but when you talk about a searchability, a findability side, we start having a lot of issues from there. So I want to just kind of baseline, and I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I talk about information architecture. And really, information architecture really breaks down into three different things: purpose, people, and language. And so the first one that you think of is purpose. Every website out there has a purpose. It has a reason for existing. It has something. That purpose could be because you're trying to sell something. That purpose could be because you're trying to educate out the community on the services you provide. It could be that you're trying to provide some type of information that may be valuable to them. There's always a reason, but there's also that purpose from the internal standpoint of why you're there, why the content is the way it is. If you're a government agency, there could be a lot of regulatory things that go around that. If you're or in an industry that has a lot of things that need to be included to understand the industry, there's just a lot of really big things. So overall, this is kind of one of those areas where we tend to spend a majority of our time when we build our websites is really on the purpose of our website. And where that's great, we sometimes forget about these other two things. The other thing is language. So especially if you're a government agency, we see this all the time from a government standpoint, where you have a language that may be unique to your organization or unique to your world that isn't readily understood by other people. There's a ton of great examples of this, but overall, one of the biggest things you think of is acronyms. Government definitely loves their acronyms, and they love to use them on a regular basis. And so a lot of times that can convey into your content, into your structure, and may not convey the meaning that they're hoping. So you always have to understand that side of information architecture too, is how things are labeled and understood, and the naming conventions we use and that kind of stuff to really make a difference. And then there's that last piece. And honestly, if we could just get rid of all these, we'd probably have a lot simpler life, because not only do we have a different purpose, and people in an organization can have different purposes, and that we have different language we use around different things, but then we have all these different people that do things differently, understand, look for information differently, and have all these different needs. And so this really is the challenge of an information architecture, is you have to take all these elements and say, well, we've got to accomplish what we're trying to do from a website perspective to convey our message, but we also need to use language that people are going to understand, but we also need to understand that sometimes people are looking for the same piece of information differently, or could be looking for different pieces of information, or maybe looking for it different ways. And so this all really comes to this overall practice about how we should really look at this. And so one of the things that we really look at from an information architecture side, just a few little common points before we get into kind of Kentico specific stuff. The first thing being, getting around a website should really be easy, and that's really important. And whether you have a 4-page website or you have a 4,000-page website, overall, there is no ability for us to say, well, because an end user thinks of this as a more complex site, that means they understand it's going to be harder to look for things and do things and really try and navigate the site. And so we really have to understand it around the way our people think. And the interesting thing is I've been doing this for a long time, and I've done it for a lot of different kind of segments of the world, but one of the biggest segments I've done it is for educational institutions. And educational institutions very much have very similar offerings, even whether it's a 4-year institution or a 2-year institution. Overall, they're very similar in that, you know, people are signing up to take classes, to potentially get a degree, or to get continuing education, or whatever it might be like that. So overall, you would think if I built one college website, I could go to any other college website, use the exact same thing that I did in that first college website, and be equally successful in that second. Well, I can tell you now, having done this numerous times over, that's not really true, because there's a lot of things, again, going back to that information architecture side of things, especially that language side of things. A lot of times when you have colleges that are in particular parts of the country, you actually find that they refer and actually see things very differently than other parts of the country. Overall, generally, there tends to be a lot of the same, but from that standpoint, you really have to look at that kind of stuff. So that's why you really need to think about organizing that information the way people really think. And so there's some great opportunities out there to do things like card sorts, which is a great information architecture activity. Tree tests, where you actually, instead of building out a site, you actually have people navigate down kind of a folder hierarchy type structure tree just to see kind of how they'd navigate with it. But overall, and this has been one of my mainstays since I've been in business, is that navigation should really be simple and always act like a multiple choice question. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is, you know, in a multiple choice question, there's typically 4, maybe 5 answers. And so sometimes you know the correct answer, and sometimes you know that another answer isn't correct. And so what I mean from that perspective is that you've got to make sure that in your navigational structure that you don't have very similar sounding terms, very similar meanings behind them, and sometimes you have to look at it that when I look at 6 or 8 or 10, really you should do no more than 10 in a global nav, but when I look at those elements, that I can tell that each of those are separate. So when I'm trying to determine the path that I'm going to go down on that site, I can actually look at one and say, maybe this is where I need to go, but more importantly, I can look at the others and say, well, I'm not sure absolutely that I need to go here, but I know for a fact I don't need to go there because they just aren't what I would be looking for. And so that can be very important from a navigational structure side, to really kind of understand that and really kind of look at it from the side of how we can really be able to go through and actually navigate this stuff in a meaningful way. So the other thing that we want to look at is we want to look at the design side of that. And the design actually plays a very important role in information architecture and really kind of the whole user experience, because one of the things that you see a lot out there is websites that have pretty colors and look really nice but aren't really functional. And so one of our philosophies is that good design should really support function. Otherwise, it should never be there just because it looks pretty, but because it can help actually navigate the, through the hierarchy. And so a lot of the things that you'll see especially that I like to do, is use color contrast and different things to be able to highlight different areas. Because the reality is, if you're looking at a page of content, especially one of these really long pages, if you had an all-white background with all blue text, eventually as people kind of scroll through that, they stop being able to really determine the different sides of that piece and really kind of understand what it means. And so you really need to look at that to kind of break up the page and the visual elements on how you can make things display easier. And it's not just about looking nice, it's actually about how people actually process information. If you ever want a really good resource for that, or really to understand how that is, look at magazines. Magazines are absolute professionals about taking a ton of content, putting it on a single page, and using shapes and colors and shading and type fonts and all that kind of stuff to really make it so that when you look at that page, you're not overwhelmed by the content and you actually feel like you can break it up in your mind about what you need to read at and how things kind of work together. And so this can be a really good piece, because even if you have great structure to your content and you have your content in the right places, if the design tends to detract from that because it's so much about the design than what it is about the function, you really need to, because everybody's coming to your website with a purpose, and the purpose is not so that they can look at pretty colors, okay, or pictures, unless maybe like you're going to Pinterest, but overall, for the most part, they're trying to actually do something, and we want to acknowledge that. The other piece, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, is about search. Especially when you start talking about sites that have really large structures, there's two things you can kind of take from a website, a large website. One, if majority of the people that visit your website search, that means your structure probably isn't very good. So a majority of people, especially even today, will tend to want to navigate through it. And especially with the increase of the mobile experience, search has still not really gotten there. You don't see a lot of people that do a ton of search activities on mobile devices. What you actually see is a lot of people that do navigational structures on mobile devices and that. So a lot of times if you start seeing trends where a lot of people are searching and not really navigating through your structure, you have a pretty good indication that there's something about that top level or where they're entering in that's very confusing to those people and what's going to happen. The other thing is you got to realize that people are really, really poor searchers. They really don't know how to do it. As a matter of fact, I just looked at, and it was for an internal system, but I just looked for one of my clients. I was looking at their intranet and some of the functions from there. And I still laugh today because on their intranet, one of the top most searched words just by itself was the word form. Somebody looking for a form. And now where I'm sure that person and those people and those thousands and thousands of people that did this thousands and thousands of times had really great expectations. Overall, when you think about it in a typical intranet or a typical whatever, how many times is the word form used across the system in that? And so that really causes a lot of issues because people don't understand. They don't know how to spell. They don't know what they're looking for. They really kind of struggle with that. And so this is kind of where sparse content causes issues. So we face this a lot with sites with a lot of sparse content and very scannable content. And when you look at how a search engine works, you really kind of have that whole concern of, well, but if you want somebody to find this by using a lot of different alternatives to be able to find it, otherwise other words, other phrasing, other things like that, and none of that exists anywhere in the content, how are you going to get them to be successful? So you kind of have to balance that from the side of how people are really going to get to something and what kind of content you really want to present. And I'm going to show a couple options on how you kind of balance that out here in a little bit. But the other thing is, and this has gotten to be more significant, is you really need to have some kind of refinements, what we call a refinement panel, or there's a lot of different terms for it, but overall some way to say and really kind of follow the pattern of the way people search, that I find something, I use those search results really to try and find something else typically. So I might do a very broad search and then I use that and see the results and try to narrow it down. A refinement would be some type of maybe categorization or something on the side that I could click in and quickly narrow down my results or different methodologies like that. But overall what that really helps is it helps me say, well, maybe I can get away with a broad term but then I can use kind of the resources of the site to help me narrow it down. You think of like an e-commerce application, and you think of like a store where now I can search on, some type of book or something, and then I could look at it and try and grab the different format, or a TV and all the different options that come along with that. That has become a very important part of the search experience, and people have gotten very used to being able to have not only rely on their own ability to create a search query, but even more so being able to rely on the system to help them actually down that path. So the last thing I'm going to say kind of on this side, and then I'm going to kind of go into the Kentico stuff, is just kind of about learning from this. And so again, one of the great sources that you can really understand where you're falling down right now and really try to make those information architecture and usability improvements is from your search logs and your web analytics and the things that you can learn from there. These are great resources for them. I'm assuming that everybody in the room has some kind of Kentico implementation, so Kentico has a great web analytics in there. But usually I actually supplement that still with Google Analytics, because Google Analytics just has a lot more deep analytics to it, where you can do things at a lot more deep level. Kentico, on the other side, has some great analytics for some very good information, but where its power really comes in, especially if you're going to do some of the enterprise marketing things, is really to integrate that in with your analytics and be able to do analysis on how things are going. And that, so I actually like to have both running at the same time in a Kentico system. But the other thing is you can look at search logs and you can really understand, what are some of the people's spelling challenges, what are the patterns that they search for, how are their searches, they may be searching for something obvious, but they don't actually get what they're expecting. There's a lot of things like that that we like to look at to really kind of understand how effective search is in that. And a lot of times what it ends up coming back is either structurally or naming-wise of pages, or content-wise, you're falling down somewhere in those areas that are going to really help you be able to boost those search results or get people to more accurate information by making some design choices from an information architecture side on how you name pages, maybe where content is located, the content inside the pages, and all those kind of things. From the web analytics side, you can really know how people do it. I see now everybody's going to know that I use this for another slide too, because actually it says the word intranet on it. You can really know what people do on your website. How do they enter it? How do they exit it? And how non-search people look for information. This is very important because you can start to understand the paths that people go. As a matter of fact, Google Analytics has a great behavioral flow tool that is really wonderful to see the paths that people take when they go inside your site. And so one of the great opportunities that you have from this is if you start understanding, say like maybe people don't actually come in on your homepage, but they actually enter through alternate pages, maybe getting it organically through search engine or something like that, you can actually use that to create what I like to call push paths. Otherwise, maybe there's something on those pages that end up whether it's related content or it's something else like that that's going to get them to push them in a direction that you'd like them to go and do that kind of stuff. Or maybe it's also placing content in multiple locations on your site, getting that really reusable side of your content to be able to kind of accommodate different experiences. So from there, kind of talking a little bit about information architecture, I kind of want to go in and talk about creating some really best practices around Kentico and how we can develop content and some of the processes that we use. So when you guys hear me break, that means I'm drinking my coffee, just in case anybody's curious. So why do we apply best practices in the first place? Well, the first thing, and again, after doing this for 17 years, I can tell you that this is just overall the #1 thing that happens is content owners ask for this and then say they wanted that. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is that you go through the process, you get ready to do the build, you start the build process, you build it, and then you give it to a content owner. It's like, well, that's great, I'm glad it can do this, but I also thought I would be able to do this really easily. And especially for any consultants in the room, you know that this happens all the time. And so it's really difficult to kind of create that business owner expectation. And so part of what it is one, sometimes they just honestly don't know what they don't know. Otherwise, they don't really understand what they're looking for. And not only do they need our help kind of understanding that, but we also have to look at building our systems in a way that maybe can provide a little bit more flexibility from that side. And so the other thing is, even though Kentico is a great tool, we have to acknowledge that it's very complex. Setting it up, getting it moving in a really especially large information architecture environment there's a lot of dependencies that get established, a lot of things that get put in there, and we really have to kind of think that out there. And so overall, why do we want to do best practices? Because really the less strife we can have from this and the happier life. And so the question is how do we really do that? Well, one of the things is we really can't let our content admins go willy-nilly. And so this is probably the #1 challenge we run into in a lot of especially modern CMS systems, is that their flexibility sometimes also causes the problem, because people can build unpredictable interfaces. Whatever you think up that your people that are going to use your website might do, I guarantee you the people that actually work in it will do something differently, whether it's using a font that you didn't think they could, or whether it's putting a green picture in the middle of the page, whether it's putting a little 120 by 120 pixel image on the page that actually is an image that is actually more like a 40 megabyte image, and I've had clients do that before because they just compressed it down and that kind of stuff. There's just so many things that we can do it. And so we got to really be careful about these content admins, and it's not that we don't like them, it's just more of the sense of that most of them tend to be business users and not have the knowledge about the technology that we do, and so we a lot of times have to look at how can we put controls in place to kind of control that. The problem is the flip side of that: when we put too many controls in it, we start getting them to complain because they want to be able to do more things. So how can we balance those two together? And so definitely the absolute luxury and the bane of our existence is Wysiwygs. What you see is what you get type editors, where people can put in rich content, they can copy and paste out of Word, they can do all these things. Anybody that's worked with this stuff know that there's a lot of problems behind it as well as a lot of opportunities from that side. The opportunities are really the convenience of being able to use these things. The problem is the bad code it brings in, the way they do things. You can't override it, just some of the things that it does to really break things. And so we really have to kind of look at that. And the last thing is that we really have to be planning for the future. So one of the things that I see in a lot of really any technology development, but especially in the web, is that people are kind of thinking of it from the right now moment. What do we need right now? Instead of really looking at it as, okay, here's what we're going to need right now, but what are we going to need in a year? What do we see needing in 3 years? What do we see needing in 5 years from that? And so really trying to build a best practice around really looking at things and being able to figure it out so that we can actually expand over a lot of time. So what are some of the challenges that we run in really in this kind of stuff? Well, one, the long page structure, which is extremely popular right now. It's really the bane of findability existence. And what I mean by that is that you take a typical website that has a very long page structure, and typically that long page structure is going to have a lot of different topics on it. Those topics could be very closely related. Sometimes those topics are not very closely related at all. And so one of the challenges that we get from this is from a searchability, whether you're using Smart Search in Canticle, or whether you're using another system, or whether you're having Google or Bing or something like that crawl it. Overall, the problem is that it's crawling it all as one single page entity. And therefore, if I had an About Us page and I had an area where I had about the way we give back to the community, I had an area about our team, I had an area about the services we offer and that kind of stuff, and somebody was out there on the web or maybe on my website or something searching on a particular service that we offer, they might actually come to that About Us page, but overall, when they actually get to that in a search result or something like that, it might say About Us, HiMonkey is a really cool company, yada, 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 but nothing about our services because that's actually buried further down the page. And so a lot of times what we see is with these long page structures, yeah, it may actually get you to the right spot, but even when you go to that page, you're not necessarily going to know, you're not going directly to the services area and that kind of stuff. So we have a lot of issues around that. And so one of the things that we do from a structural standpoint that I'm going to show you is kind of around how can we bypass that and actually make our systems a little bit more usable from that standpoint, from a search strategy. And so the other thing we have is a lot of structured content maybe needs to be surfaced in different areas differently. So this is kind of where that other piece comes in, where we're looking at how do we really structure our content, and people don't just always follow a hierarchical methodology for it. Otherwise, a piece of content lives in one spot and that spot only. But a lot of people may need to find the same piece of information through different paths as well. And we really want to give our content contributors flexible power, but we also want to have that structural control around what we do. So some of the things we can do from a solution standpoint, first is leverage really Kentico at esse core. There's a lot of power there that we can do to not only create very flexible structures, but also put some structural controls in place as well, while still giving our people kind of that out-of-the-box piece. And so we really give that flexibility of admins to kind of pick and choose what they want on the page, yet we're kind of controlling how it all looks at. And again, I am actually going to get to screens, so this is all going to make a lot more sense from that side. Use the modularness of Kentico. That's one of the things I really like about Kentico and other modern CMSs these days, is how you can kind of modularize things and really kind of chunk down content and do that. One of the things is obviously separating some of the content storage from the presentation, and really quit thinking so structurally that I've got to have everything in a structural order. We do a lot of systems where, you know, maybe we actually have a place where information is stored that actually never people actually never navigate to those pages, but we actually roll that up into a different area of the site and that kind of stuff. And that's really where you can use the repeaters and the hierarchical viewers and a lot of the different web parts that you can do to really kind of roll that kind of stuff. Think about it from content sparse. You know, if content is sparse, you might be thinking about adding additional fields that you could also have crawled as part of the search. It might not even be something that readily displays on the page, but it's something that actually gives the search engine more understanding of where things actually sit on the page, the descriptions of what's there, and that kind of stuff. And the last piece being, you know, think about search from day one. This is something that I'll admit even in the past we didn't do probably as much as we should have, and that is really kind of think of this from the side of what you're looking at. Now again, if you have a site that has very, very little information, this is not as big a deal because people aren't going to tend to search across those in the first place. But if you have a really large site with lots and lots of information, you want to make sure that your search strategy is really there at day one and how you're going to make that happen and what are some of the things you want to put in place, because Lord knows if you end up having 4,000 pages on your site and then down the road you realize that search isn't that good and then you have to go back and actually make some type of change to make search better, that could be a really massive effort inside itself. Oh, I think I accidentally. So let's look at this kind of from a user interface view from there. So one of the things that a lot of times we do, and I'm actually going to go back to the Kentico screenshots as well, but I kind of want to show this from kind of what a person would see and then actually what the behind the scenes would be as well. So every page can be broken down into sections. So this is one of the things that we really like from this standpoint. Is really the ability to really kind of break things down into their separate sectional components. And that kind of stuff. One of the things is this really does is, one, it gives us the opportunity to actually be able to push these sections into search and actually have things searchable by section. So now maybe instead of just finding this entire page, maybe I actually am finding this particular section in a page for that. It really gives a lot of better management and flexibility. So one of the things we like to do is kind of use different templates for this. So you could have one that, like in this particular thing, you know, it's like a featured case study versus the way the blog post versus the way we have column. Basically kind of build templates then use, and then you use the logic of Kentico to kind of dynamically build the pages versus having them build it all out as one complete page. They're now building kind of these, hold on because I will get to the Kentico screen that this kind of relates to. The other thing that kind of goes tag categorization tool, we can use drop downs, we can use choice fields, we have a lot of different options there basically to kind of create a what does this really allow us? Well, instead of having to store these case studies on the page and actually literally put them in there, maybe we have something where we're flagging like this is a featured case study, and or maybe it's a category because I wanted to show it on one of my individual services page. You can have that to be able to basically pull that information into different locations on your kind of in the hierarchical web viewer kind of stuff, really to kind of pull information across your site. So one thing, even doesn't have a lot of content, you'll find that you start seeing a lot of the similar content in a lot of different pages, because we realize that, you know, when you're viewing, maybe you want to see related posts, or if you're looking Kentico, you want a tagging structure, basically to be able to say, okay, this is a Kentico type project, maybe this is something in the government space, this is here, and that, and now I can create different structures very quickly. As a matter of fact, when we get good enough at this, it becomes actually very easy then to and structures, so that basically when you're like a content editor, let's say that you had a product and you were wanting to add a new product, and that maybe you could just add the page and say, okay, here's the product I want placed on this page, and the page just kind of dynamically builds itself. And so this really gives some great flexibility and some ease of use from the standpoint of how people do it from a content editor perspective. And there's really a lot of power that can go along that in there. And so how does this really work? Well, really, when you look at it, we're still storing things in the structural side of the page things, but now instead of just having a single home page, we're actually looking at the different pieces that we actually place across the page in that. And so now we could have these different sections in the page that maybe have different descriptors around what actually happens. The really cool part about this is when you do this, is this doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing over and over. And so we've actually done this to a level with another client that we not only had sections that had like 1-column layout, 2-column layout, 4-column layouts, kind of the different ways they laid out, or maybe the different backgrounds that they used, or different things, structural information from a different content source, whatever it could be. But then on top of that, we also have had clients where we build a section and then actually build sub-components underneath of it where they can add more micro pieces. You say, well, why would you do that when you could just, well, again, this is kind of that structural control piece. Our content admins a lot of flexibility around how the page is going to be laid out. So maybe on that first area I want this 1-column piece, but on the second area I want this bulleted list that comes out for you. I want some type of photo slider. I take that photo slider and I want to move it up the page to the top, and now that actually becomes the top component of the page. So what we're really doing is we're kind of giving people the ability, just like inside Kentico and adding web parts or widgets, but we're doing it at a more granular level. The other thing that we like to do for this exact reason is because now let's say that maybe a person, you know, maybe on your home page you have 6 different content editors and they have different controls over different pieces. Well, overall now, I can say that only these people can manage the featured element, these people can manage web, these people can manage the latest blogs, whatever that, so do that across these structures and do a lot of that kind of stuff. So you really structural view to kind of put this in a very structural contents, but give your content admins a really easy structure they want to use to display a particular piece of content and what type of content's there. So there's a lot of flexibility that kind of goes in there from that side. And then on top of that, you have, you know, kind of the page types that go behind it. So again, each of these has its own page type. I'm showing a blog post here because we tend to pull blog posts a lot about there. But really from that page type now, and in controlling a majority of the look and feel inside kind of the form itself, you're able to, again, kind of give them that flexibility to do different things, but you're maintaining some control over really how it works. And so you're also creating that consistency. One of the things I really like to do here is have additional fields to support the roll-up and other activities. I'm going to show that on the next slide in there. But one thing I always want to mention, and this is something that really kind of gets me, and again, this kind of goes back to that statement I said about planning for the future, is I really recommend, if you can possibly do it, and don't worry, you haven't done anything wrong if you've already done this, because most people have, but overall the recommendation is never really use a base page type. So anybody that doesn't know this, when you create a page type in the back-end administrative interface, you can actually create a new one, or you can use an existing one, or you can create a new one and inherit from an existing one. So often when we create new page types, if it's similar to one out there and that actually kind of matches up, we'll actually use one of the old ones to inherit from, so that we're pulling in its fields, and then add our own field. Why do you do this? This goes back to that earlier statement about planning for the future. When you think about a system like Kentico or anything else, and you think about from an upgradability path or just kind of flexibility path, do you really want to change the core of the system, or do you want to extend the core to be able to do what you want? So then you're kind of thinking from the standpoint of how pages are laid out and that kind of stuff, and kind of looking at that next step and being able to say, well, now we can change this, but we don't really have to worry about how this affects the core structure from that side, and it gives you a lot more flexibility. Because the other thing is, like, if you take like the blog page type that's inside Kentico, and you change that, now if you want to run another site on that, whatever changes you did to the first one is also going to be applied to the second one, because you've changed the base one. In extending it by creating a new page type on your own, or a new component on your own, basically you're saying, okay, I want to use this information, but I also want to do something new with it. But then if somebody else wants to use that as well, they can go do something else new with it as well. So really it kind of gives you that flexibility. But overall you can do things like, you'll see right here, is this a featured post? So again, kind of a piece of data that we can use then to roll up to the home page. So there's a lot of ways that you can do that, and it might be things that don't necessarily appear on the page, but kind of support what you want to do with the content that's in the page itself. And so kind of the next piece then is really kind of looking at this from a structural standpoint, from metadata. Now this honestly could be a talk inside itself. But overall, what you're seeing here is some of the use that we have of categories. And so one of the things that we like to do is we'll use like the category structure, or you could use document tagging. I prefer the categories. I think it's a little bit slicker interface than just letting people tag things, because that's a little bit more willy-nilly. But we have a consistent content tagging structure that goes across all of our things, from this actually being one of our case studies, to one of our blog posts, to one of our pages. Everything is tagged with a consistent categorization, so then when we actually look at search, we actually look at rolling up things, we have this consistency there. But it doesn't only go to the categories. So one of the things that you can have here that I think is really interesting is, again, and so this is where I kind of talk about that support. So we actually have a client that we just rolled out something for recently, that what we ended up doing is they were mandated a lot on the content that they needed to put on their page. It was a government agency. They were mandated on that type of content. But what they were finding is that content wasn't very searchable, because people didn't know what to search from there, that they actually had other ways that they wanted people to search. So what we ended up actually doing from that side is we actually ended up adding additional fields on here. That was the title, because a lot of their concern was around the page title, which was mandated by the feds on how that title is described. And so they would want in search the title to show up differently, so that it actually was better descriptor of what actually was on the page. So we actually had additional fields. It was a search title, a search description, categorization for search, and then like an image that we could show in search, and all these different kinds of things. Well, we could have just as easily used a page metadata, but again, we wanted to kind of do this a little bit differently, be able to pull it in. But once we were able to do that, we were actually able to bring that into the search structure itself. So then the search, what it does is it actually brings up the specifically built information for the search engine versus the information that's on the page itself. And the real value is that sometimes you might want to do it. So I'll give you a good example. let's say that you know, I'm going to go back to a college scenario just because I deal with this a lot, and you have a program like accounting out there in that, and so you might be mandated to show some structural pieces from, you know, what are the programs you need to offer, what are the courses you need to offer, maybe the way you describe it has some mandated language in there and that kind of stuff. But overall, when somebody actually goes to a search engine, and especially if you're dealing with some of the colleges, you know, and you're dealing with an 18-year-old, they might just say, I want to be an accountant, and they might actually go it. And we actually see that a lot where people kind of, because Google has gotten the people to give people the ability to do so many kind of free word type searches, that they'll go to your search and they'll actually do things like, I want to be an accountant in that. Well, that's great, but what if the word, it's the accounting program, it's accounting courses, it's information about how to do accounting, and then I say the word accountant and I want to be, a lot of times in most searches that won't be found. And so being able to actually do something separate, and they're now, instead of actually coming up to some really mundane thing that says accounting program, maybe it says learn to be an accountant, you know, when I hit the search results. And in the search description now, it's really about, have you ever wondered what it would be like to be an accountant, da 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 da, however you wanted it like that, and there's tags in there that we can use for refinement and all that kind of stuff. So overall, there's a lot of power in adding other fields that maybe don't display on the page, and this again is where you kind of think of those next steps. Even if you have a smaller site now, but you see having it larger or wanting to do something different with it, putting these hooks, as I like to call them, in place up front can really provide a lot of power for how things are done and really kind of how the way we go it. And of course, from that side, it's a huge thing for search, which tends in large information architectures really to be one of the things we struggle at. And so from that side, we also look at really being able to do generic transformations. So if you're a business user in this and you haven't really played with this, transformations is how we actually display content in there, kind of behind the scenes in Kentico in that. And so one of the great things is it's very easy to create that roll-up technology. And there's not a lot of real code that needs to go in there to kind of make it so that as you build those sections underneath a page, the code can actually be smart enough on how to roll that up onto the parent page and display it correctly. And so this is really a great use of the hierarchical viewer web part. If you haven't looked at that one, it's a very powerful web part that not only allows you to display information in a roll-up type format, but also do some great things. And if you have not, Joel Darlene did a webinar, I think it was 2 months ago, as part of the CUG on the hierarchical viewer, which you would be should be on the CUG site that you can actually view. That'll give you some great information about that tool. So let's just talk a little bit about search, and we'll kind of wrap up there from that side. So really, what this also gives you the opportunity is really to create some next-gen search. Now, I'm going to be honest right here, what you're seeing on the page is actually not coming out of Smart Search in Kentico. This is actually coming out of SharePoint 2013 search. And we're kind of looking at other search engines that you can kind of bring into play for this to be able to do a little bit more. But part of what really gives it is the more hooks you have into this information, the better you can kind of display search results on a page and some of the, and really have that ability to show content your way. So now that we've done good categorization, we have good content, we really kind of understand this stuff, we're able to do a lot of things from this. First, one of my favorite things is, just like Google, is to be able to highlight specific content. So actually, if you go to our search page right now, you would actually see this, and that is that if you search on words like Kentico or SharePoint or web and that kind of stuff, there's going to be an associated blog post that comes up on that page that actually is there. So you think of it from that Google structure, like if you search on like Hi Monkey on Google, you're going to have that sidebar that's going to show you everything about our organization and that kind of stuff. So this really gives you a lot of opportunity to highlight things based off search and that kind of stuff. You have the ability to show items differently. So one of my favorite things, and this is what, even though Google keeps an unbelievably simple interface, it's still very valuable in that it likes to show information on the same page very differently. So if you see just page results, you see them as kind of more of your traditional results that you see. If you see images, that's up in an image block. If you see things that you could buy at the store, it comes in the shopping block. All those different things kind of go not only to be able to segment out that content, but also to visually segment out the page better so that you can kind of see it. So you can see here that actually our case studies come up in kind of a roll-up where you can kind of look at them and actually go through the slider in that. But again, kind of from that last standpoint of really kind of looking from this, where this power really comes in is that there's information that I can hook into. So then when somebody performs some kind of search, I can sit there and say, okay, so somebody searched on SharePoint, or I want to learn about SharePoint, or SharePoint rocks, or whatever like that, whatever they might search like that. And I highly doubt anybody ever searches on the phrase SharePoint rocks, but you know, maybe out there. But from that standpoint, now that we've tagged it with the categorization in the back end, we can actually do some magic in the search itself to be able to relate that together and actually be able to pull that stuff up in a meaningful way. So the real power behind that is really the ability to be able to look at this. And you know, where I love Kentico, Smart Search has been one of the areas that really have just not gotten to that place that I'd like it to be. And I don't knock Kentico for that, because there's not another CMS out there that really has a solid search engine built into it. The reality is search is kind of a vertical market on itself. So in this particular instance, we use SharePoint 2013, but you could use other search engines. We've used the Caveo search engine. We've used Mondo Search. There's a lot of different things. We've used Lucene installations. There's a lot of different options out there. And as a matter of fact, if you go onto our search engine, you search on Next Gen Search, this kind of talks about how I integrated it with SharePoint 2013 search. But I've kind of delayed the rest of my posts on that because I'm actually also looking at how, instead of using SharePoint 2013 because some of its limitations and especially cost of the tool, how you could actually do some of this with Azure Search, which is a much less expensive thing that actually integrates really well, especially if you're deploying in Azure and that kind of stuff. So overall, really getting these hooks in there. But the real power that comes out of that is really from a categorization standpoint. So not only am I able to be able to show information on the page a lot differently, but then I'm also able to pull up these refiners that are basically based off the categorization we did or some of the other metadata that comes in here. So not only now am I doing good search, but then if it happens to be a really broad search, I'm offered really good refiners that I can figure out so that I can actually look at it, so that I could look at a development or everything that's been categorized with SharePoint or strategy. We actually did this at one of our colleges where it actually is related programs. So if I search on accounting, it's going to give a refiner of alternate programs that you could attend and that kind of stuff. So there's really a lot of things that you can do from this standpoint, really to put a lot of power into the search creation and that kind of stuff. And all that and all the page structure and everything is really based on how we did things up front. So to kind of wrap this up here, and I think I'm coming up at a good time, and then we can open it up to any questions maybe people have. And if you have one in the room, you can just ask, and Brian will let me know it. Otherwise, if you have it online, you can type it in the question and answer area in the GoToWebinar thing. But overall, from that side, it really does come from this page structure. And it's the way we structure things, it's the way we look at things, and it's really about how we bring it all together. If we do this really smartly and we really think about how the whole process works together, we can create a very scalable system that we can do a lot of things. So we create content that is really usable, it can be reusable, it can be searchable, and it can be relatable with one another, so we can have an overall understanding of how this ecosystem that is our website or websites kind of work together, and how you can kind of bring that content in there. And that really also affects in search, which makes it very scalable and flexible. You can do a lot of really powerful things from this. None of this is easy. There are a lot of work that goes into this type of process, but overall the value is that you're getting somebody who doesn't have any idea who you are, that comes to your website and actually looks at it, actually understands it, actually figures out what to get to and how to get to it successfully, and has a much better experience on your website. So depending on what type of website you have, you may deliver that differently, but overall the end result is if you have a website out there, you want people to be able to find stuff, do stuff, get things they need on your website and not have a lot of difficulty about it, because what happens is they'll come back again, they'll use your services, they'll do so many things above that. So really that's what this all comes down to. So I'm going to open it up for questions, but again, if you don't have a question now or if you want to reach out to me, you're more than welcome to email me or feel free to tweet me or whatever like that, and I'm more than happy to kind of answer a question in that. So thank you very much. I'll kind of leave it open here for the next few minutes and see if we have any questions online. And if